Okay, welcome to this seminar. This is part of a long project that David Sloan Wilson and I have on a new paradigm for economics based on extended Darwinism. And we are writing a 5-article series that's virtually finished now. They're coming out, the articles are coming out one after the other. And the first article was basically on what extended Darwinism is and what it potentially means for economics. And the second article, which I want to talk about today, is about the core idea behind this paradigm, which runs counter to the thinking in virtually all of neoclassical and behavioral economics. And the core idea is functional organization. And what it is and what its implications is terribly important, and its implications cover all of economic activity, and consequently, getting this foundation right is absolutely critical. The neoclassical paradigm is based on machines. You've got inputs and outputs. You know what your objective is. You know what means you have to get to the objective, and you need to reach it most efficiently. This paradigm is not about machines, but it's about living things. And living things behave very differently, as I'll have plenty of opportunity to say, but living things evolve. And the evolutionary process, which is now permeated with all the natural sciences and is also entering economics via cultural evolution, this process is based on variation, selection, and replication or transmission. And variation means that individual decision-making units are different. And selection means that of these different units, some will be more successful in surviving and propagating than others. And then those who are successful are also most successful in transmitting genes in the case of biology, or ideas and technologies and norms and values in the case of cultural evolution. And an entire framework of thought can be built on this, because depending on what is selected, you'll have ideas or technologies moving forward that will then determine the setting within which a new set of actors makes their decisions. So the process of selection, which is which people, ideas, and so on, do we want to carry forward and make influential, have them spread in a population, that depends very much on the context, including the social context in which actors act. And in this paradigm, it is impossible to understand economics without understanding the social foundations of it. And so the process of selection depends on provides a context for decision-making. If it's an individualistic society with people making individual decisions, that provides a particular social context. If these people form cohesive communities, it provides a different social context. And that context influences people's preferences, because people get well-being and also decision utility, not only in their capacity as individuals, but also in their capacity as members of groups to which they belong. And unlike other animals, human beings are very flexible in their affiliations to different groups. And consequently, these preferences will then determine what is selected in the next period. So you can think of a loop in which you have context that gives rise to certain selection pressures. These selection pressures change the context. That affects people's preferences, which feeds back into the context in the selection system. So that, I think, is sort of the basic idea that we need to keep in mind. And this new paradigm that we're developing is called the multi-level paradigm, because we can function at different levels. We can function as individuals. We can function as members of a wide variety of groups. They can be economic groups like firms and households, or they can be political groups or social groups. And human beings, as I said, are very flexible in terms of their affiliation. And the multi-level paradigm can be understood as a general framework in which levels of selection and contexts affect well-being and thereby also affect behavior. This comes close to what Adam Smith had in mind in terms of division of labor and specialization, which economists have, at least mainstream economists have, a very abridged understanding of. For Adam Smith, the division of labor and specialization was particularly important with regard to knowledge. And as knowledge is accumulated and people specialize, they have access to their particular domains of knowledge, but do not have access to other domains. And they cooperate so that the whole, the different pieces of knowledge that they all bear, can be greater than the sum of the parts. And this creates not only interdependencies among people, but it also creates radical uncertainty, because we do not know the outcome of most interactions that we have. If we could predict probabilistically the outcome of any conversation that you have with others, then that conversation would basically become superfluous, or at least extremely boring. And consequently, I think the starting point for understanding this new paradigm is that levels of selection, whether they're at individual level or various group levels, and the uncertainty, the radical uncertainty that this creates, is the starting point from which around which the rest of the thinking can be developed. It is extremely important, therefore, to understand how this differs from the neoclassical paradigm. And the neoclassical paradigm, as I said, is modeled after machines. Decision-making is located in individual entities. They could be individuals, they could be firms that act like individuals, or households that act like individuals, and they're all pictured as rational agents. These individuals have clear objectives with inputs and outputs. They maximize, or they follow heuristics, whatever it is. The level of functional organization in this way of thinking, this paradigm, is fixed. You will not have a firm morphing into something else. And the types of group units that we identify in economics, households, firms, financial institutions, and so on, they're all fixed in terms of their identities, and they make individuated decisions as if each of them were a rational actor. And then these rational actors, they demand and supply things in economic markets, and these markets move into a state of equilibrium. That is the neoclassical paradigm. The multi-level paradigm, being modeled after living things, starts with the idea that living things adapt to ever-changing environments. There's also a lot of niche construction that takes place so that we change the environment in which we're in by acting on it. And so we evolve in part in response to our own behavior. And so economic activity is analyzed primarily in terms of context-dependent collective action. Human beings have never been solitary creatures. We have, throughout our entire evolutionary history, we have always worked in groups. And most of the problems that we face in life are collective problems. Obviously, with regard to knowledge, that's very obvious. But with regards to other things, family life, in the political and economic sphere, most of the issues are always collective issues. Collective action problems are a special case in the neoclassical paradigm. Here it is the norm. So non-living things are not designed to do anything. They just do they just do whatever it is these non-living things are meant to do. A chair is meant to be sat on. It's mechanical. And the way in neoclassical behavioral economics, behavior is modeled, that's also mechanical. You maximize something, you follow a heuristic, and so forth. Organisms and their artifacts, the things that organisms create, they're designed to do something. And so the individual organism is a fundamental unit of analysis only insofar as this unit of analysis is the target of selection. So that means that if individual action is the cohesive thing, then you need to analyze the individual. Let's say each of us as individuals is a sum total of many different cells and organs in our body, and a biome that contains many other creatures. But usually we act, unless we have serious cases of cancer, sufficiently in harmony with one another so that all these different components can be seen as part of one individual, and the individual becomes the unit of analysis. With honeybees, the unit of analysis is the hive, and the role that each of them play within that hive is something that is analogous to some degree to the role that organs play within our body. And so with human beings, the target of selection can be distributed. In certain contexts, the individual may be the target level of selection. In most contexts, it will be groups. And since each individual usually belongs to many different groups that each of them evolve, you get a dynamic evolution of targets of selection. In economics, the target of selection is obviously the level at which cooperative or competitive forces operate. And when we say that the firm is a target of selection, that's what we have in mind, that those who are in the firm cooperate and the firm competes with other firms. Other institutions and systems generally, economic systems, can also be seen as a target of selection, as nations often are. And therefore, looking at systems in terms of evolving targets of selection is very, very important. Now, it's important to distinguish between two different types of adaptive systems that adapt to their environment. One is a complex adaptive system. Different people are different. It's a complex system, and it adapts as a system. Or it can be a system in which each the subcomponents, small subgroups or agents, act as a unit of selection. The entire system is behaves adaptively. That is a CAS1 system, of first type of complex adaptive system. The second were the individual subgroups or agents act following their own adaptive strategies. That's a CAS2 system. CAS2 systems virtually never self-organize into a CAS1 system, which in economic terms means that the invisible hand, as it is set out in neoclassical economics, virtually never holds true, which is something that economists themselves imply when they say the invisible hand only works under very, very restrictive conditions that we never encounter in practice. Now, alongside functional organization, it is important to understand what agency means. Neoclassical and behavioral economics has no concept of agency in the sense that I wish to use it, David and I wish to use it here, which is agency refers to the exercise of individuals or groups' capacity to make choices based on goals, desires, or intentions, and then to act on these choices in order to influence outcomes that are relevant to these individuals and groups. So it is the act of having influence on your environment in ways that affect your life goals. And exercising agency is a very important source of well-being that is quite separate from consumption and leisure and the standard arguments of a utility function that the economists usually have in mind. And understanding that properly, that having agency, having influence over one's environmental sphere, that's important in and of itself, quite independently of what we get in response in terms of consumption goods, is really important. If I took you and put you into solitary confinement, then you'd have far less agency. And if I then said, well, what do I need to do in terms of consumption to make you just as well off as you were before, you would say, this is a silly question because I can't be compensated. And that shows how important agency is, and particularly nowadays in this fractured world in which populists often say we need to take back control. That is all about agency. And even if that means reducing your standard of living, having control over your environment is seen as something important. And agency can be distributed between individual decision makers and the groups to which these decision makers belong. And so understand, this has nothing to do with the economic term agent or principal agent problems at all. It is something active. It is something that you exercise. And individual agency is as I said, the ability to make independent decisions, act autonomously, and you direct your action towards goals that you yourself have formulated in response to the challenges that your environment has given you. And and these goals, the way you exercise agency in the animal world is very simple. You don't know what you will encounter in your environment, and therefore you exercise agency by perceiving something and then responding to it in an adaptive way, the feedback control. And human beings have an executive tier in which they can monitor their decision-making and simulate action plans before actually doing something, and also reflective tier when they can reflect on the process whereby they make decisions and self-regulate. I have more to say about that later. But in addition, we also have social agency. And social agency encompasses all the collective decisions that we make in groups. And this means we are members of groups that have shared goals and have joint action to pursue these goals. Not only that, but we also have joint perceptions. What we perceive is very strongly influenced by what others in our group perceive, not only via the attentional field that is focused on things that others perceive, but also through various, what in behavioral economics are known as biases, following the crowd, prestige bias, conformity bias, are all ways in which our perceptions and our intentionality and attention depends on what is done around us. And that generates knowledge, norms, values, beliefs, which are all joint. And people engaging in groups join in collaborative activities that then shape their individual lives. And moral agency concerns an individual's capacity to make moral judgments in accordance with moral principles and take responsibility for these. But these are all moral actions or actions that are meant to induce you to behave beyond enlightened self-interest. So social agency is important. Just as we can derive our well-being as individuals, when I eat a banana, then I ingest it, I act as an individual. But when I act in my capacity as a father or a colleague, so then I'm a member of a group with certain social roles, and social agency becomes important. And as I said before, since most of our challenges are collective, our challenges, social agency will play a very important role. So what does the concept of an agent mean under those within this framing? Well, an agent is a unit that has a sense of identity. The individual identity is derived from my self-definition by acting in a certain way, the empowerment I have when I do so, and my understanding of my reflexive self-monitoring when I choose to act in certain ways. That defines my individual identity. And my social identity, obviously, depends on my belonging to groups, what groups I'm a member of, the roles I have, what expectations I have of others and they have of me, and what collective action we perform within these groups. And so in order to understand anything about economics, it is important to understand the social agency within which these economic activities take place. The other important point is, as I've mentioned before, is distributed agency. Agency can be distributed across different levels, from the individual to the group level, where the groups could be extremely heterogeneous. And they also can cover many different domains. There's an economic domain where we transact, which is the least social in a sense, because one reason why the price system works is if you don't buy my product, I can sell it to someone else. So people are substitutable in some sense, and therefore the economic transactions are anonymizable, And that is obviously something that undermines some social relations. We often find that intrinsic motivation is often undermined by monetary costs because of this anonymization that occurs. And we have agency in the social domain and in the political domain as well. Much in the economic domain that is not anonymous has elements of the social in it. And what we decide to put in what domain becomes terribly important for economic activity. So we have different agency at different levels from macro to micro in different domains, economic, political, and social. And we have various mechanisms whereby the agency is channeled in these domains. We have internal mechanisms. Those could be psychological motives like care or anger or fear or achievement. We've got identities, norms, values, narratives. They are all internal mechanisms that enable us to understand the world and motivate us to behave in particular ways. And then there are external mechanisms that guide agency. Those are rules for allocating contributions to public goods and allocating the costs of these contributions, monitoring rewards and sanctions for good and bad behavior, dispute resolution mechanisms, and so forth. So we have both internal and external mechanisms that help channel our agency. And identity economics, started by George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton, has important elements of this because in identity economic theory, you have utility functions depending on what's relevant for the individual, but there's also something that depends entirely on what the group thinks and wants. And both of these are relevant. And where the multi-level paradigm goes beyond at least the simple identity economics models is in recognizing that the levels of selection, both in terms of macro, micro, and also in terms of the domain, evolve through time. And most of the interesting action in economics involves this evolution in the level and domain of selection. So let me try to explain sort of much more precisely what agency really means in terms of levels of selection. Decision-making in neoclassical economics is very straightforward. We have preferences, we've got constraints, and we want to satisfy our preferences subject to our constraints. That determines our decision, and that basically determines our action. Our environment provides information. It also guides our beliefs, and the information, the beliefs generate expectations. They operate on the constraints and also affect our decision-making processes. But it's a very simple model where our objectives and our constraints are the main contenders here. Now, if you look at in biology, virtually everything is feedback control. And the ancient vertebrates in evolution, you have some amphibious creature that is wondering whether to eat something next to it in the water. Do I eat or do I not eat? Go, no, go is the decision that needs to be made. The goal is the environment has set a challenge, and the challenge is to find enough food to survive. So that's the goal, to get food, but one doesn't want to eat oneself. So there you have your goal. The environment also affects your attention and perceptions. Depending on what you see, you could maybe see dangers, and if there's a danger of a predator, you might not want to go and predate yourself. But if there are no dangers, then you will. And so the environment determines what your attention and perceptions are. Then on that basis, you will decide whether to pursue your goal or not. And that determines the action. That is how, so that is a more sophisticated way of seeing things than neoclassical economics has for human beings, in my opinion. But you now then go on to ancient mammals, and they have intentional agency. I'm using the terms of Tomasello. He's written a wonderful book recently on the evolution of agency, but he's been writing on this subject for some time. And ancient mammals have an executive tier that determines their motives. And as I said, motives, psychological motives, are things that give energy and direction to your actions. So it could be care, like mother-infant, or affiliation, that you feel you want to be part of a group, or it could be achievement, want to achieve something better than someone else. So it could be status or power, or it could be anger or fear, various motives. With the executive tier, you simulate your action plan in advance. You think, if I do this, then this could happen, and then I evaluate my different action plans and choose one of them, given what I have simulated internally. And that will determine my motives. And these motives will then determine what goal I have. So clearly, if I am angry, I'll have quite different goals from if I am caring. And anger and care are antagonistic motives. They can't be felt properly together with the same vehemence. And so these motives will determine your objectives, your preference function. Different motives will give you a different preference function. At the same time, the motives will also determine your attentional field. If you're angry, you will look out or fearful, you'll look out for quite different things than if you're caring or you're in an affiliative state. Consequently, what you perceive gets filtered in completely different ways depending on what motive you have. And that motive, as I said, will determine your goal. That goal will determine your decision. Your decision will determine your action. Your action will affect your environment. Your environment will, the challenge that you face will change as a result. The environment will also affect your attention and perceptions. And so you have an interaction here in which the concept of agency has been expanded, because now you have this executive tier that leads to motives that enables you to behave much more flexibly and in much more considered fashion than you were able to do before. And then you have the next stage is rational agency, and that is great apes demonstrated to have rational agency, and that is the opportunity to self-reflect, to monitor, troubleshoot, intervene in your decision-making, depending on how you see that it goes, and then proceed on to the executive tier later on. And so your motives are then determined in a much more considered way, and the rest of the system still holds. So great apes demonstrate that. And then you have the next stage, and that is the human beings. Oopsie. There we are. Human beings are capable of social agency. Now, great apes are capable of some social agency, but we are the only creature that is able to function in such flexible ways socially and have collective action that is so flexible in response to our challenges. So the challenges that we face for our environment, they determine what it is that we need to do. The level of functional organization will determine what our joint capabilities are. Then we have a joint reflective tier, a joint executive tier, joint motives. A crowd can be angry, and emotional contagion and so on becomes important. Joint intentions that then determine joint objectives that you have that induce you to make collective action, joint decisions that lead to these joint actions that affect the environment, which in turn affects your joint attentional field and your joint perceptions and your joint beliefs, which feeds back into your motives. So human beings are very flexible in that regard, and taking that seriously is what the multi-level paradigm is about. Now, since I am short of time, I have a mathematical analysis of how this feedback control under radical uncertainty works, where you do not understand something about your environment and you learn about it, and the feedback control enables you to react in ways where you can respond flexibly to the challenge that you face, and then observe what the upshot of your action was in order to behave further. But I don't have enough time to go through these feedback control strategies. But there is a literature out there, some of it applied to economics, much of it in engineering, that enables you to do an analysis on the basis of feedback control under radical uncertainty. Not only that, but also take into account adaptability becomes important, which is how quickly can you adapt to your environment. Adapting to your environment is costly, but you learn faster, and you can build models of feedback control with learning and adaptability investment, so that the analysis can become rigorous in a very straightforward way. But because you have radical uncertainty, the concept of efficiency is no longer relevant, because if you don't know what your ultimate objective ought to be, because you don't understand the challenge, if you don't know what the means are whereby to reach that challenge, but you do want to survive and propagate, then you have a different type of problem. And adaptability becomes important, resilience, robustness becomes important, and you're in a different decision-making world. The other thing that is important is to remember that the economy, which is the place where economic transactions take place, takes place within a polity, that is what organizes power relations among people, and that takes place within a society, which are basically the set of all persistent social interactions between people, which takes place within an environment. And so to understand that the economy is embedded is particularly important. Uncertainty is prevalent, that is, it is always around, and it's one of the starting points, as I said, of our analysis. And functional organization is flexible as an adaptive strategy in response to uncertainty. If our environment were not uncertain or were risky, just in the probabilistic sense, we would not need flexibility of functional organization. The uncertainty that we face is partly epistemological. We don't have enough knowledge or information, but partly also ontological. That is, we haven't conceptualized the problem properly, and we're dealing with unknown unknowns, which are not irrelevant for decision making because they may induce us to invest more in learning and adaptability in order to figure out our situation. The types of uncertainty, there's chance uncertainty, which is probabilistic risk, domain uncertainty, where we don't know what the domain of outcomes is, and conceptual uncertainty, that's like ontological uncertainty, where we just don't know whether we're applying the right concepts. Sources of uncertainty are not only uncertainty in the physical world. We get a hurricane or an earthquake that comes out of nowhere, but it also emerges from the flexibility of functional organization itself, that our social interactions, usually interactions conducted under uncertainty because we're learning more about other people, and in the process of learning, we make different decisions, and this process generates more uncertainty and so on. Now, in the face of this uncertainty, the appropriate response is what we call cognitive diversity, which means you need a diversity of approaches to economic analysis, because when you face uncertainty, you may operate under a certain set of assumptions, but if you then become surprised that these assumptions are falsified by the evidence, then you may wish to switch to a different set of assumptions that implies a different model of reality, which is also consistent with much of the evidence, but has different predictive properties. And so cognitive diversity becomes terribly important. It is also recognized to be important in psychology. Melanie Klein distinguishes between the depressive position and the paranoid schizoid position, which David Tuckett has called the split state and the integrative state. And if you split, then you think this model of reality I have is right and everything else is wrong. And the integrative state is one where you keep an open mind as to what models of reality are right, and then you're better able to adapt to surprises in an uncertain world. And so cognitive diversity in this analysis is as important as biodiversity in the biological sphere. So multi-level decision-making is an implication of this, that because people act in their capacity as individuals, but also in their capacity as members of many different groups, their decision-making should be considered decision-making at different levels, as members of groups as well as individuals. And to what degree your activity depends on what you want to do as an individual, and to what degree you're following a role within a group, that's not predetermined. That is the result of the exercise of your agency, which depends on the level of functional organization that you have. The functional organization, as I said, affects the context, which affect the motives that in turn affect the functional organization. So you have a loop whereby your motives, functional organization, and context are determined, and life may be understood in terms of the ongoing evolution of this loop. And flourishing, what we wish to achieve in life, also operates at multiple levels. just like selection operates at multiple levels. And so multi-level flourishing emphasizes the need to balance our personal goals with the group goals that we have. And to what degree we wish to rely on our individual capabilities versus the collective ones. And the appropriate level of functional organization can be undermined. That is, we might have climate change, but we're not responding to it properly because of the exercise of power in the economic, social, and political domain, lobbying groups by fossil fuel firms, for example, or the fragmentation of authority, that we don't have the external mechanisms in place that will enable us to behave in a coherent way. Finally, what I'd like to say is that my team and I have been working on 4 drivers of flourishing, things that push us towards flourishing, and we summarize it by the word SAGE. SAGE stands for solidarity. To what degree we feel affiliated with or cohesive with the social groups to which we belong. A is agency, G is material gain, the things that economists are mainly concerned with, and E is environmental connectedness, to what degree we see ourselves as part of the natural world. And all 4 of them are necessary for flourishing. In order for a human being to flourish, you need to belong and be embedded in social groups. You need to be able to exercise agency. You obviously need enough goods and services to sustain life with dignity. And you need to act in a way that enables your environment to be sustainable. And we have measured this SAGE dashboard for 160 countries, and we find that these elements move to a large degree quite independently of one another. And countries that are doing quite well economically in terms of the GNP per capita, or growth of median income and so forth, can be rising, but solidarity and agency can be slumping, which is what happened before both elections in which President Trump won, and it also happened prior to the Brexit referendum. So the idea that politicians often have when they tell voters, you've never had it so good, that may apply to G, the material goods, but it does not apply to other aspects of well-being that the multi-level paradigm highlights. And therefore, we get a broader conception of what it means to be human, but also what it means to behave in the economic world. Our economic activity is motivated not just by our need to gain goods and services, maximize some form of consumption, but also because we wish to exercise agency and because we wish to be embedded in social groups in an adaptive way whereby our collective capacities can be exercised to meet the collective challenges that our environment poses. That's as far as I would like to take it now, and that does leave nearly 10 minutes for questions and hopefully answers as we move forward. So if any of you would like to ask me a question, please go ahead. If there are any questions, underlying paper, which is very soon to be published, I believe is available to you through INET, and that paper also contains my emails. So if you have questions to ask me, please feel free to send me emails. Good. Wonderful. All right. In which case, thank you very much, and till next time.